Let's begin with a really plain statement. Britain is growing a little but paying a lot. Our economy is not in free fall yet, but our prices run ahead of our peers, and that's the uncomfortable pairing that frames today's argument. The latest international forecasts are blunt. Growth in the UK is set to be modest rather than miserable. Inflation, however, is set to be the highest in the G7 in 2025 and still elevated in 2026. Households will feel it in the weekly shop, in the service bill and at the pump. The Bank of England feels it in the uneasy space between cutting too soon and cutting too late, and ministers feel it because voters do. So the questions write themselves. What is really driving this inflation bump? Who carries responsibility? And what should we do that's practical, fast and honest? So here are three objectives. 1, to separate the signal from the noise. 2, to assign responsibility without theatrics. And 3, to offer a short list of fixes that would lower prices by raising capacity, not by clever slogans. So the first one, 3 facts matter. First, prices in Britain re-accelerated through 2024 into 2025, led by food, hospitality and regulated bills such as energy, water and transport. That's not a mystery. When regulated items jump together, the index jumps with them. When wage growth cools only gradually, services inflation cools only gradually. The second fact is that the bank sits in a bind. Cut hard and risk loosening price expectations that have only just been re-anchored, hold steady and risk squeezing a softening labour market. This is a textbook dilemma in a country that has weak investment and fragile productivity. When supply is tight, demand shows up as price, not as output. Fact 3, top-line GDP can mislead. Per head growth is threadbare. If the economy expands by a little while population expands by a little more, families do not feel richer. That is why the national story and the household story sound so different. Those are the facts, now to the blame. And there are 3 easy villains. The Chancellor today, the Prime Minister who was not, and the project that split a continent from its neighbourhood. All 3 matter, each in a different way. Rachel Reeves, the incumbent, I think must take some blame. Since taking office, the Treasury has signalled fiscal caution while raising some business costs through taxes and regulation. Firms in services have passed part of those costs to prices. The messaging on future tax and spending has sometimes been heavy on resolve, light on certainty, which can slow private investment right when we need it. What would be unfair is to claim that the current Chancellor created the 2025 inflation bump. The prime drivers are regulated price resets and a wage price dance that began before she picked up the red box. Her choices influence the slope, not the starting point. The verdict is she takes medium responsibility in the near term. Her policy can lighten or darken the pass through the chasm from costs to prices. It cannot erase the underlying pressure on its own. She doesn't have the competence to ease the path, but she mustn't take the blame for putting us on that path. Liz Truss is the second problem, and what is fair is that the 2022 mini-budget did real damage. Gilt markets panicked, mortgages reset higher, the UK picked up a risk premium that took time to fade, and that raised the level of interest rates needed to hold the line on prices, and it dented business investment plans. What would be unfair is to pretend that episode explains everything today. Panic fades, the premium narrows. The nasty mortgages remain, of course, scars remain. When you burn the toast, the smoke alarm stays sensitive. The verdict is a legacy responsibility, fading but not forgotten. It makes the bank's job harder. It leaves households paying for past errors through higher borrowing costs than they would otherwise have. The third responsibility, the third blame should be Brexit, the structural backdrop. And what is fair is that since 2016 we have traded with more friction, invested less than our prior trend and tightened specific labour markets. Fewer but messier forms, queues at borders and uncertainty around standards all show up in costs. A smaller, slower supply side means any demand pulse buys more inflation and less output. What would be unfair is to say that nothing can be fixed. It can be fixed. We can cut frictions without reopening the war of 2016, but we must say plainly that our inflation is not just a price story, it's a capacity story. If you shrink the factory and keep the orders, prices rise. The verdict is that Brexit accounts for a great deal. It must take large and continuing responsibility for our present problems. Brexit is the long shadow over productivity, trade intensity and per head growth. It is the quiet cause of loud prices. Add a quieter culprit, global tariffs and uncertainty, and households and firms front-loaded spending early in 2025 to beat higher prices, then paused. That gave a sugar rush, not a meal. External shocks do not explain Britain's outlier status, but they do lean against disinflation. So, if we must choose a main villain, we should choose Brexit for structure, Truss for scars, and Rachel Reeves for choices. That is the honest hierarchy. However, we need to move on from there. Having established the villains, we need to say what we do next. So here's a short, serious list of 5 moves that would lower prices by lifting capacity and credibility. 1. We need to fix the Brexit plumbing. We need to do the small things that matter. A veterinary and SPS accord to smooth food trade. Mutual recognition in professional services that is legally feasible. A youth mobility scheme that eases pressure where vacancies are chronic. A trusted trader and data sharing push with the EU to shorten border time. None of this requires a constitutional earthquake. All of it widens supply and narrows the inflation wedge. We should put our mind on solving Brexit rather than messing around with small boats. Secondly, we need to give the bank cover with fiscal clarity. We need to publish a medium-term path that protects public investment rather than salami slicing it. We need to lock in full expensing. Stop changing the corporate rulebook every season. Lower the UK risk premium, and the MPC can cut sooner without losing the anchor on expectations. Credibility is a price control of the best kind. It works through yields, not slogans. Thirdly, we need to smooth regulated bills. We must make sure that we don't let energy, water and rail spike in unison. Use predictable smoothing so that we don't import CPI hump through policy timetables. If government schedules the shocks, government can stagger them. So far it hasn't done that. It needs to get its act together. Number 4, we need to stop taxing investment like consumption. We need to make full expensing permanent in both letter and spirit. We need to accelerate planning for housing, grids and major projects. We need to set a stable carbon path. When firms believe they can build, they build. When they build, supply expands. When supply expands, inflation cools without recession. 5. We need to treat labour market frictions as inflation policy. We need to target skills where shortages drive pay price persistence. We need to support return to work for the long-term sick with partial incentives and fast access to treatment. We need to ease childcare bottlenecks that stop people taking hours they want. A wider workforce is not a slogan about welfare, it's an anti-inflation tool. Notice what I'm not proposing. I'm not proposing a bonfire of rates. That would risk unanchoring expectations and would raise prices through a weaker currency and stronger import costs. I'm not proposing austerity theatre that cuts investment and calls it prudence. That would depress supply and entrench low growth. I'm not proposing a fantasy in which we raise barriers and expect prices to fall. Protection is a tax that hides on the shelf label. So let's return to where I began. Britain is growing a little but paying a lot. If we can shout at the bank for not cutting, we can shout at the Chancellor for not spending, we can shout at the past for not staying in the past. Or we can widen the economy's throat so that demand flows as output, not as price. If we want lower inflation, we must raise capacity. If we want durable cuts in interest rates, we must lower the risk premium by being predictable, not theatrical. If we want per head growth, we must repair the trading pipes with the continent next door. So choose your villain if you must. Rachel Reeves bears responsibility for choices now. Truss left a scar that still itches. Brexit set the stage on which everyone else performs at the moment. But villains do not fix the plot. Writers do, editors do, builders do, dare I say politicians do. Sort the plumbing, back the bank with credibility, not heckling. Smooth the bills we control, stop taxing the future to fund the past. Free people to work, train and invest. Do that and Britain stops being the outlier on prices. Do that and the argument moves from blame to progress. Do that and the bank can ease without fear. It's not a grand theory. It's a to-do list. And if we want a future in Britain that costs less and earns more, we should start ticking the boxes tonight. We should start doing things now.